With the Iran war in full swing and many Americans believing that Donald Trump began the war to distract from the Epstein Files, we thought it would be more important than ever to just keep talking about Jeffrey Epstein, no matter what happens. We'll be doing a weekly breakdown of some part of the Epstein story each week. This week, we explore mentions of Jewish supremacy in the Epstein Files. Why was Jeffrey Epstein so intent on helping further the goals of Israel? What was the deal with his obsession about genetics? And what in the world does the word goyim mean? We'll be touching on these questions and more on this episode of the Jet Fuel Can't Melt Steel Beans podcast. I'm your host, Michael Mooney, and this is episode number 18, Jewish Supremacy in the Epstein Files.
This is the age of misinformation, get information. No homosexuals, Democrats, or immigrants in your nation. I gotta think about anything else. I try to cope, but it's bad for my health. I don't even think that anything helps. This is the most paranoid that I've felt. This is the age of misinformation. How could you be sitting so patient with all the sins that you'll be committing?
Welcome back to the Jet Fuel Can't Melt Steel Beams podcast. This week we'll be talking about a subject that's a little bit more on the touchy side. This week, we're going to be talking about Jeffrey Epstein. We're going to start really diving into the Epstein Files this week, looking at specific emails, especially as it pertains to Jewish supremacy. And to talk about such a touchy subject, I thought we would start with a sort of disclaimer. As I've been poring over some of these Epstein documents, I want to make it clear that Jewish supremacy does not equal a Jewish conspiracy. I want to get this across because there's quite a big difference. And if you've heard the third episode of the podcast on Jewish space lasers, you'll know that I don't have particular patience for Jewish conspiracies. But I think there is a way to approach this subject matter, with some lens of objectivity. And a good starting place is probably right here. Why is Epstein so obsessed with furthering the goals of Israel and Israeli intelligence? And the episode this week is going to, in part, try to answer that question. So what do I mean when I say Jewish supremacy does not equal a Jewish conspiracy? When I'm talking about Jewish supremacy, I'm talking about something that genuinely resides in the hearts of a lot of the people that were in Epstein's close circles. I'm not talking about the entire Epstein class, as Ro Khanna has coined the term, just talking about the portion of that class that was furthering the goals of Israel. And even in that, I want to be more careful because it's not necessarily everyone who's furthering the goals of Israel, as we'll kind of talk about in a moment, but it's the people furthering the goals of Israel who also believe that Jewish people belong to a supreme class. Epstein and some of his closest friends, advisors, business partners, they believe that Jewish genetics were superior to all other genetics, which helps explain the loyalty to Israel, in part. So while Jewish supremacy is this belief that Jewish genetics are superior, a Jewish conspiracy is when a cabal of these people get together and influence things in a way to act on that. Whereas a simple belief in Jewish supremacy is just believing in those superior genetics. So I do want to hammer that point home and give one example to illustrate where I'm coming from on this. Jewish supremacy doesn't equal a Jewish conspiracy because many people in this nation, the United States of America, believe in some version of a white Christian nationalism. However, we usually don't go around talking about an evangelical conspiracy or a Catholic conspiracy, at least in these days. And the last time when we were genuinely talking about some Catholic conspiracy involving the Pope was when we elected JFK in 1960 and had questions about his allegiance. While the term white is a little bit messier of a category than the ethnic term of Jewish, we do see the difference between a conspiracy and a belief in supremacy quite clearly here. The idea of a Catholic conspiracy is out of fashion, while the idea of a Jewish conspiracy happens to be in fashion at this moment. So let's wade into these waters knowing that we're talking about a mindset that Jeffrey Epstein and some of his closest associates had, especially those associates that were heavily involved in Israel. And with that, we should feel a little bit more comfortable to tackle this problem of Jewish supremacy. So this won't be a definitive case study on the idea of Jewish supremacy in the Epstein Files. This is going to serve as more of like an introductory episode. We'll probably have to revisit this topic a few times. And I can't even say that I feel comfortable, knowing what the full breadth of this is just by reading what I've read. These ideas of Jewish supremacy and superior Jewish genetics seem to be heavily associated with Epstein, to the point where, he's openly joking about it with people that he's close with. Two names that come up quite a lot are Larry Summers and Kathy Rumler. So it's quite clear that Epstein isn't shy or, bashful about these beliefs of his. What I saw wasn't necessarily, talks of how to tinker with the levers of society in a certain way to benefit Jewish people. But what I instead found was almost sort of a light atmosphere. Like this was a, pet topic of Epstein's, something that he genuinely believed in, but also something that he was willing to, joke about and poke a stick at. And at one point, as I'll end the episode with, we even see Epstein kind of pushing back on some of the more Jewish supremacist ideas that some of the others in the Epstein class had. And how does Jewish supremacy relate to Jeffrey Epstein doing stuff for the state of Israel? Israel is the vehicle to sort of bring about and enforce Jewish supremacy, at least in the Israeli homeland. So if you believe that Israel in itself is a Jewish conspiracy, then maybe you can say that, Epstein is as much part of some conspiracy as an average citizen of Israel is. But beyond that, Epstein was hitching his wagon to Israel for a couple reasons. When you read articles from the mainstream press, there become two reasons that they'll give for why Jeffrey Epstein was aiding the state of Israel so thoroughly and so often. The first idea they give is that Epstein's allegiance to Israel has to do with his Jewish supremacy. But the second idea is something that the mainstream media seems a lot more comfortable talking about in some respects, is the idea that Jeffrey Epstein was merely taking advantage of all these systems, i.e. the Israeli intelligence in the form of the Mossad and USA intelligence in the form of the CIA and their interconnectedness in close circles to essentially further his own career. And at times, past the 2008 sweetheart deal, when he would go to jail for sex trafficking, he wanted to rehab his image. And so it made sense for him to donate to causes that helped Israel and for him to be able to turn around to other Israelis and, people involved in the CIA and the Mossad and say, look, I donate to all these causes for Israel. I'm furthering the goals of the intelligence establishment. And so this allowed him to ease into society, at least the upper crust of society, a little bit easier. And we can see this in some of the emails that are dated 2010, 2011, when he's making this full-throated entry back onto the scene. Now, beyond a Jewish conspiracy, there are also plenty of conspiracies about Jewish people, and I would say the two of them are at least addressed in the Epstein Files. First is the sort of cosmopolitan nature of the Epstein class that we see in these files, and that's something that, both the Jewish people have been accused of and international bankers and financiers. And sometimes those two categories are unfortunately conflated completely. And we also get the idea of, these meetings between Jewish intellectuals to talk about, what the goals of Israel or, what Jewish people are even. And this is what the media often refers to as these dinners with Woody Allen. It just turns out that a lot of these dinners, especially the ones that had Woody Allen, were referred to as Yum Yum dinners, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a play on Yom Kippur. Epstein would brag about bringing together these meetings of Jewish intellectuals. But I don't think any of this is untrue of the entire Epstein class, even the portions of it that aren't Jewish. And many portions of the Epstein class aren't Jewish. We all know there's a very strong evangelical component to the support for Israel, and members of the Epstein class often aren't confined to a single nation. In fact, they're quite able to use their wealth, status, and power to wreck certain nations and then completely remove themselves from them. Plenty of people have dinners together without there being some nasty behind-the-doors cabal-like conspiracy. And if we're going to go by those standards anyways, then even a meeting inside like a Mormon church or even Mass on like an Easter Sunday, any of those could be considered some religious conspiracy, a Jewish conspiracy, an evangelical conspiracy, an Islamic conspiracy. And so if you believe all those things to be conspiracies, then let's at least be intellectually consistent here. Finally, before we jump right into the emails and I start showing them on the screen, there are two sorts of reasons I hear for the establishment of Israel and a Jewish state in general. There's a more sympathetic version of the story where Jewish people go through this period of extreme anti-Semitism in Europe and frankly across the world, where they need a home state to protect themselves, especially from events like the Holocaust. But then fast forward several decades, there's also a second side of the story where we see Israel become a vehicle for Jewish supremacy. There's just a law passed in part with the help of Itamar Ben-Gvir that literally puts a death punishment on the books for only Palestinians for certain kinds of terrorism against the state and doesn't call for the prosecution of Jewish people. But even in that, we do have to be fair with ourselves and say that just because the system, the government of Israel passed such a law, doesn't mean it's actually reflective of not only all the people in Israel, but definitely not all Jewish people. So to say that Epstein only became involved in furthering Israel's goals, especially on an intelligence level, just to rehab his 2008 image after the sex trafficking charges, doesn't make sense when you don't include the parts about Epstein's inherent belief in Jewish supremacy. Now let's look at the files. For this podcast, I use jmail.world when I'm looking at the Epstein files, and they have a real simple, search engine where I search key terms. And maybe rather ignorantly, I started parsing through the files by typing in phrases like Jewish supremacy, stupid, Jewish blood, also stupid, and superior DNA. The only thing you immediately find from those searches, other than all these articles that Epstein's associates would email to him or that Epstein would find and email to other people, were all these references to 23andMe. 23andMe is a company that takes DNA kits and basically tests your lineage to find out what percentage, of each nationality you are. And Epstein would often order these kits and send them to people's houses, partly as sort of a joke and partly being dead serious. What we often see is Epstein sending these 23andMe DNA kits to associates of his to sort of prove how Jewish they were. In fact, one anecdote that I can't fully verify with you on this episode, but that I've heard on other podcasts, is that Jeffrey Epstein was one of the only human beings to have his genome fully mapped, using his connections and his money, of course. But beyond the 23andMe DNA kits, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a future episode, typing these key terms didn't really lead me anywhere. So I did end up asking Google for help, and what do you know it, they were quite helpful in reminding me of a certain word that I could be searching up. And that word is usually said in two forms, goy and goyim. And at this point in the story, some people who heard me say that I have no patience for the idea of a Jewish conspiracy might be scratching their heads. But when you start typing in the words goy and goyim into the Epstein files, you actually do see many references to this. One aside about searching up goy and goyim in the files, though, is that Epstein, especially because he doesn't try to spell for shit in these files, often types G-O-Y or goy instead of G-O-V, the abbreviation for governor. So you see many apparent cases in the files where Epstein was supposed to use the word governor and just ends up typing goy. And it would make no sense if it actually meant the other definition. And before we go on, I'll give you what Google gives me for the definition of goyim, which is the Hebrew or Yiddish term for non-Jews. The singular is goy. It is frequently used in Jewish literature to denote nations. The term is used, at least sometimes, derogatorily, and it's also a term that you'll probably hear 100 times in the latest Nick Fuentes video. So many who believe in Jewish supremacy use the term goyim for all non-Jews in this disparaging way. However, there's also a specific type of goyim, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, referred to as a WASP, that Epstein and his friends have quite the time almost roasting. Like, oh, that person makes good investments for a WASP. Or that person knew good kosher food for a WASP. So then the terms goyim or goy and WASP become two of the more helpful search terms when looking for Jewish supremacy examples in the Epstein files. Like, here's an example from the Epstein files of one from an email from Barry Zellin to Jeffrey Epstein. And it says, leaving for New York City after being in Florida for 2 weeks, thought I might bump into you somehow. It didn't happen. It appears that you and the press are still joined at the hip for the moment. Too bad for you. The plebeians stay entertained. I will tell you this, it is an interesting scene at the Colony on Friday night at Club I.O., and the goyim in general know how to have a good time. I like to watch, so Palm Beach is fun, but give me the keys any day of the week. The crowd at the Ferrari shows at the Breakers was remarkable for its international participants. The women and men were spectacular, so were the cars. That's my report. Work awaits me. Stay sane. So that casual throwaway of the goyim in general know how to have a good time, and the idea that the sentence right before it used the word plebeian shows that Jeffrey Epstein and his friends are really looking down on this class of people that represents most people. But most of the references are as innocuous as that. It really is just a throwaway joke that is representative of an ideal that these men have. And I don't want to be uninclusive there. Some of the women, like Kathy Rumler, also share this belief. Then there's this email that made the rounds from October 23rd, 2009, from Jeffrey Epstein to a Roger Schenck. And it goes like this. This is the way the Jew makes money, and made a fortune in the past 10 years, selling short the shipping futures. Let the goyim deal in the real world. From shipping news, the most dramatic growth has been in shipping futures, which allow shipping companies to lay off risks. The most popular futures are forward freight agreements, FFAs, to deliver goods on a particular route at some point in the future. They have grown in the past year to be roughly the size of the physical market, according to Bill Lyons of the Baltic Exchange, a shipping bazaar in London that sells FFAs. Many in the industry have been suspicious of such futures because they have been averse to hedging their bets. Risk-taking is, after all, part of the game, and adverse to complicated financial instruments that they don't fully understand. Here's another email from 2009 between a redacted person and Jeffrey Epstein. The redacted person said, I went to this funeral yesterday and had to stand for 2 friggin' hours. Did not have the nerve to ask the ancient wasps to get up for me. And remember, that's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Then went to lunch reception and stood for another 2 hours. No friggin' wasp chairs. This after sitting in a friggin' SUV for 3 hours in the pouring rain on the way out and sitting another 2 hours at dinner. This morning in swim class, I was a bit lame and the wound is warm. I am in this walk-in clinic right now for a checkup. I know Jews don't walk in anywhere, but it's wound care. Will call after, never a dull moment. So this email between this redacted character and Jeffrey Epstein shows us this mentality, that Jews are here and the goyim and the wasps are right here. It's the separation between what I assume from the email is this, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant funeral and what this person, is usually used to, which is a Jewish funeral, and the differences between those. It says here, no friggin' wasp chairs. So I'm assuming that there are more places to sit at a Jewish funeral. And then there's that secondary reference to, going into a clinic and how Jews don't walk in anywhere, but it's wound care. Again, all of this is mostly in lighthearted fun, but it does show a mindset that Jeffrey Epstein and his associates had. And by the way, redacted ended up apparently getting an infection in the friggin' wound. Or this between publicist Peggy Segal and Jeffrey Epstein, where she asks, is it going to be 100% Jew night? Even Perlman on Yum Yum has some goyim. I am getting my media elite list FedExed out for Saturday and will email some names. And Jeffrey Epstein replies about this Yum Yum dinner, no, goyim in abundance. JP Morgan execs, brilliant wasps. Which also kind of, throws stones at the idea, that all of these banking institutions are just filled with Jews when Jewish people like Jeffrey Epstein are referring to the board as a bunch of brilliant wasps. About one of these dinners, Peggy Segal emails Epstein, did you invite Woody to dinner and not me? Starving. Having dinner with those big Jews, Sting and Trudy tonight. Can visit you tomorrow unless you're praying all day. And it seems like there's plenty of emails in the Epstein files that are confirmations for big individuals to be attending these Yum Yum dinners. So let me now read you from another email from Peggy Segal to Epstein that goes over the idea of these Yum Yum dinners. It says, I love the idea of small dinners. And this email, by the way, is from August 6th, 2010. It says line item number 2, which is actually supposed to be number 3 because there's already a number 2. I love the idea of small dinners, but not too small because house is too big. Think about Rosh Hashanah or Yom Yom Kippur. Think about getting top political, military minds to speak. You put a list together and I will too. You need to tell hot Jews soon before their relatives make them come to their tables, so timing is important. It will be easier to get to smart goyim on those nights because no one plans major social events. Actually, we'll check with Mona Ackerman. She lives with Richard Cohen from Washington Post and see if she does anything. Perlman does do family and friends, but his lists have gotten very random, i.e. Lorraine Bracco and Penny Marshall. Again, most of these names aren't important to this idea of Jewish supremacy. You might have to personally call the guests and then send them to remind card and email. Your personal touch is important on the first few. And Epstein's reply to all of this is okay. And it's after that email that we see a bunch of these confirmations for all these guests that are attending these yum yum dinners. If you also type in yum yum to the Epstein Files, you're going to see some pretty lewd comments about, girls in bikinis and photos that have been classified or redacted. And Jeffrey Epstein simply responding to things like this with the word yum. Pretty fucking disgusting behavior. But you'll also find information on these yum yum dinners. And one of the reasons that's explicitly given for these yum yum dinners in their organization is the idea of getting Jeffrey Epstein to be readmitted by society after his 2008 charges. If Jeffrey Epstein is at least partially one of the organizers behind such big ideas in the Jewish community, then it's hard not to accept him back into these circles that he used to roam in. Here's another email about WASPs from December 19th, 2011, between Jeffrey Epstein and Faith Cates. Faith Cates said, "Will you do this for Robin? 3 question marks, see below." That part we don't need to really get. But she says, "Finally had my board interview yesterday with 3 of the biggest WASPs you have ever seen, the type with junior and initials before, their names and bow ties and red socks. Jeffrey and I were dying. You may actually have to come through with that kitchen after all. You got me into this, but I think I'm getting a great deal. The apartment is really beautiful, big open space. I'm very happy. We'll be happier if they accept us. Thanks for pushing me to do it. XOXO, me." You kind of get the feeling that they say that there's really no perfect racial slur against white people, especially when people are throwing the term honky about. But the way that they use the word WASP here is not only quite derogatory, but I would say it is quite the sick burn. Let me read that again. They say 3 of the biggest WASPs you have ever seen, the type with junior and initials before their names, and bow ties and red socks. I mean, if that's not a sick burn or doesn't illustrate a very clear picture in your head, then I really don't know. I think you might be lying to yourself. There's a few emails between Epstein and Larry Summers talking about this idea of Jewish DNA. And then there's these emails between Epstein and Kathy Rumler, which are really just, one of a few that talk about the subject from November of 2017. Kathy says, "My brother did that DNA testing thing, and it said he was 7% Jewish." Epstein, implying that brother is smart, says, "No wonder." And all of that is sort of summarized in this email from Redacted to Jeffrey Epstein that says, "I found criteria to find smart people. The more Jew you are, the smarter you are. You said you're 98% Jew. You're very smart. My ex-boss is 78% Jew. He is super smart, less smart than you are. I have a close friend business partner who is 99.3% Jew. He is crazily smart. We take all Jewish people. Sourcing can be done through relatives. Ask them to do 23andMe tests." Bingo right there. "Do event for everyone who is 98% Jew. Also, all of them are not religious. Do you think it makes sense, right?" And in a sort of turn of events, Epstein replies, "Maybe it's too much. Lots of smart people are other nationalities. I was just thinking about the most outstanding people I know, which is subjective." If your Jewish supremacy is enough to even bother Jeffrey Epstein, then you're probably doing something wrong. So there you have it. Just over the emails that we went over in this episode, we can clearly see this obsession with Jewish genetics, the difference between Jews and goyim, and this almost bullying nature towards what they consider to be WASPs. What I want to continue to do on this podcast is find examples that can really illustrate for us this connection between Jewish supremacy and Epstein working for the state of Israel. But for now, I think a few things are important to really hammer home. Parts of the Epstein class definitely throw the word goyim and goy and wasp around in a way that would indicate that the separation between Jews and non-Jews is always on the front of their mind. We also see a bit of an obsession with genetics to the point where Jeffrey Epstein was sending 23andMe kits to random people that he was meeting to prove whether they were Jewish or not, or had any Jewish blood. We also find that the tone of most of the communications between Epstein and his associates are lighthearted in nature, but they still do show off a casual sort of racism or supremacy that's hard to deny. And when you have laws that are newly on the book in Israel that give the death penalty to some races over others, it's hard not to see the byline through this casual supremacy and the laws which are enacted in Israel, and Israel as a vehicle to enact this supremacy. It's not a supremacy that's any different than you would see with a Catholic supremacy or an Islamic supremacy or even a German supremacy like the one found in Nazi Germany. But the emails don't necessarily point towards some Jewish cabal pulling the strings of society in certain ways. Instead, we see a group of people who definitely believe that Jewish genes are superior and whose actions may reflect some of those mentalities, but we don't see a conspiracy beyond the scopes of other religions, nationalities, and identities. And that's just where we begin the conversation. All right, guys, I appreciate you sticking with me through some interesting content this week. I think it is really important to drill home the idea of why Epstein is associated with Israel of all countries. But I think it's also important not to confirm some of the stereotypes that have unfortunately been placed on the Jewish people for a long, long time now. Next week, we'll be talking about something pretty provocative as well. We'll pose the question, is Jeffrey Epstein still alive, through the lens of some of the mentions that are made in the Epstein Files? Did Epstein actually get facial reconstruction surgery and come back as Palm Beach Pete? Was Epstein actually murdered in his cell instead of hanging himself by a paper noose, as documents say? Or is Epstein simply walking around Israel as we speak right now, a free man? Tune in next week to get some of those questions at least partially answered. I'm your host, Michael Mooney, and this has been episode number 18 of the Jet Fuel Can't Melt Steel Beams podcast. Thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week.